If tomorrow starts without me, there's something you should know. While I hold you close, never let you go.
Hello and welcome to The Broken Pack, a podcast focused on giving sibling loss survivors a platform to share their stories and to be heard, something that many sibling loss survivors state that they never have had. Sibling loss is misunderstood. The Broken Pack exists to change that and to support survivors. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Dean. In today's episode, I spoke with Susan Kellam, the author of Brilliant Disguise, a Memoir. Susan is a journalist and a writer. She started her career at Rolling Stone magazine, and she's a surviving sibling. We spoke about losing her brother to suicide and where she is in her life with her grief today. Take a listen.
Cause you never know, you just never know.
Content warning, today's episode contains talk of suicide. Please take care as you listen to the episode. There are resources in the show notes regarding suicide. So welcome to the show. How would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
I tend to think of myself as a longtime journalist, although my career has had a wide spectrum in terms of starting out in the sort of more musical scene. You know, sometimes I think it's funny to say I started my career at Rolling Stone magazine in the 70s and ended my full-time career at the Brookings Institution as a communications expert, and they couldn't be more different. So it's like I went the arc. And I say my career ended, but when I moved up here, I was still doing quite a bit of writing and editing.
Do you consider yourself retired?
No, I don't consider myself retired. I am writing. Now, I will say, like my first 12 years moving from Washington to Maine, my first 10, 12 years, I was really busy. I mean, I had so much because I had been at Brookings, so I knew people. And then the Obama White House brought me in to do the economic report. And then a lot of other people were calling me, and I just had so much work. I had the Shingle word sharpener, and I finally just had to say, I'm taking it down. I'm just not picking any more clients. Yeah. But I am writing. So the days are mine, and I'm probably really coming to grips with what it means to go hiking one day, or not be sitting at my desk.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the reason we're talking is you wrote this beautiful book that you sent me last year. So we can talk about that now or throughout the interview, however you would like to do that.
Okay.
So you are also a surviving sibling.
I am.
Before we talk about losing your brother, Robert, what would you like to say about him and introduce him to us?
Robert was 3 years older than me, and we had a difficult childhood, which I talk about quite a bit in the book. And I felt like he was my protector, and he was sort of the one pillar in the family that I could trust and be with. And he became a fairly outgoing, amazing person, man, husband, father. He did everything with such perfect charm. I mean, he was so charismatic. When I was in high school, before he went off to college, friends would come over to my house just to go in his bedroom. Everybody really idolized him and looked up to him. And he was not a tall person. Actually, I don't think he was more than 5'8", but he was big K. I was little K. He was big K. And people just adored him.
I do remember chuckling out loud when I read that about your friends wanting to see his bedroom.
Yeah, I guess I could have taken it the wrong way in some ways, but I was shy back then. I'm not now, but I was then. And I'm not sure that I would have become part of a certain crowd if I had not been Robert's sister. I also think he bribed guys to ask me out on dates too.
What makes you think that?
Because there would be certain dances, and I just got the sense that it would be fun to take Big K's sister to the dance more than it would be fun to take Susan to the dance. I mean, it's funny because I went to college in Madison, Wisconsin, and sometimes I wonder how much I just had to get away from that and not be his little sister.
It struck me very much because this is your memoir. And for our listeners, it's called Brilliant Disguise, a Memoir. It struck me a lot about how in your whole life, You were trying to get out of the shadows of the difficult things that had happened.
Right.
So it's interesting to hear you say you also wonder if you were just trying to get out of the shadow of being your brother's little sister.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm saying that now. I'm not sure. I mean, I was shy. So having him there, having people look at me as somebody was supportive to me. And I remember leaving for college and suddenly it was nobody knew Robert Kelly. They only knew me. And I think I changed a lot when I went off to college. Exactly. And I think really from there, I went to New York City. I led this great sort of fun life. I mean, it was crazy and chaotic and at times quite difficult and painful, but it was what I wanted. I wanted to really live life. It's complicated because toward the end, I mean, when he actually took his life, it shattered me. But in a way, there were things that I could look back on and say, of course, why did he do those things in his life? Make odd decisions, destructive. The beginning of understanding who Robert really was. And I was probably too young at the time to fully grasp it. But my brother was an excellent student. He was a straight A student. He was very, very smart. He went off to Penn State, partly because our father was in Harrisburg. And I think my dad told him he'd get him a car if he went there because he was accepted to colleges that maybe he would have liked. I don't know. My mother certainly wanted him to go to the University of Virginia, but he went to Penn State and basically was not actually going to classes. So he flunked out his freshman year. And that's a wake-up call. That's a significant wake-up call. Now, he had a girlfriend, Faye, and some of it was his coming back and being with Faye all the time. But I think that to have gone from being such a terrific student to not being a student, I mean, it was definitely a wake-up call. And I was young at the time. I personally hadn't left for college yet. I was finishing high school. I was applying to colleges. And sometimes because I had spent 17 years always seeing Robert as my rock, that it became difficult. It was not until an incident when I was living in New York City that I understood that he was, in fact, vulnerable. But I had not seen him as vulnerable. And I think certainly the first significant sign was flunking out of college. I mean, it made no sense. Mm-hmm. I was very, very sad for him. You know, I mean, we had a certain bond and I hurt for him. I hurt that it happened. I started to understand it was partly a put down to my father because my father really wanted him to be at Penn State. But there's no question it was a cry for help. He was in a lot of pain. Yes, I do think that I was in a lot of pain too. And I think that some of that came out coming to grips with it myself. Now, it's interesting because I was much more willing to pick up the phone and call Robert and say, I'm really depressed. I'm really sad. I'm really this. I'm really that. And he would never have done that with me. I mean, it was very one way. Now, he was the big brother, but he very much was there when I called. I said, you know, for any number of reasons why I was very upset and depressed. And one probably might have thought that I would be the one more susceptible to ultimately taking my life. But I've had so much time to evaluate. He's been gone so long now. I just see what I've done with my life. And I think I was just always very strong in a way that I don't think that I was as affected as Robert was by the breakup of the marriage and the way it broke up and the trauma of it. He was 6, I was 3. So he would have been very traumatized by the fact that our father, a lawyer, was charged with embezzling a client's money. He was disbarred. He was thrown out. My mother left him. My mother took us away to my grandmother's house. We had cousins and aunts and uncles that were like the epitome of success stories, and the kids were success stories. And there was Robert and I, and we were sharing a bedroom at my grandmother's house. It was very hard.
How did that affect your relationship with him as a child when you were still young and sharing a bedroom and growing up?
I always felt like he was very protective toward me. I think there were certainly times over the years where I became the bratty little sister. I was so many things. I was the bratty little sister. My childhood, from the outside, I would have looked like I was the damaged one. I had pretty much one friend, and I had my dog. For a long time, that was kind of my life. I was very slow to become more social. I mean, some of it may be too, I was small, and also I'm a late December birthday. They pushed me ahead because they felt like I tested well, so I should go with the upper grade, and never did anything when initially I really was not adjusting. I didn't adjust particularly well to school, and I didn't adjust very well socially until later.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? From a emotional perspective, sometimes children, I think a little less now, but are pushed into that higher grade, and then they're not quite in the same place as their peers.
Right. I really wasn't. I really was not. Plus, I was clearly very hurt by this remarkably dramatic, sudden, violent per se, but in a way it was violent, I think, to yank her children away from their home, away from their father. It was rough. But I'm not sure I really thought about a lot of that until I wrote this book. One thing I should say, if you don't mind, a little bit of a segue, but in that vein, I initially wrote the book to be much more of a rock and roll story. I thought I had those just really exciting, interesting experiences in New York. I always wanted to get it down on paper, and I did. But also, Robert was in it. He was definitely part of the story, but he was very much in the background. And my whole childhood was pretty much not in the book. When I started sending it out to agents, one of the agents said to me, look, this is a fun book. This is a good story, and I like it. She says, but I think you need to develop your brother. Your brother's in it. And I clearly had the suicide in the book, but she says, you need to delve into that. And she was right. Although I think other people made similar kinds of comments. But when I thought about it and realized that that was what I had to do, I began seeing a therapist. It took quite a few years of therapy to really come to grips with the way our childhood affected us and how differently we reacted to it. But I began to understand the ways that we were very affected. I don't know if I could have done that without therapy.
As a psychologist, I'm very happy to hear that you had the support. And also, there's a little bit of sadness, I feel, for your younger self, in which you were carrying so much of that for so long.
In retrospect, I don't think of myself as an unhappy child. I think I had my own world. I had my dogs, my other pets, and I created an imaginary world that I lived in. I was not unhappy in that world. I was also always an avid reader. I still am. So books were there. I mean, I had a lot of escapes. I just wasn't necessarily comfortable socially, which is funny because here I am now and I'm absolutely comfortable socially.
Glad to hear that. I recommend this book to everybody. Every one of our listeners should read this, but it's very clear that you had to be a social person.
But certainly by the time I arrived in New York City, I'd had the years in college, and I actually stayed in Madison for 1 year after. I was actually nearly going to marry a guy in Madison, Wisconsin. But one day I think I just said, I don't want to do this. I moved out from him, but stayed in Madison for 1 extra year, which was a lot of fun. And then I realized I had to go to New York.
Hmm. There was a part in the very beginning of the book, I read it like 4 times, on page 7. You described Robert as a bulldozer, and that you said, just when I thought I had figured out the way the world worked, Robert went and flattened it. Some things were better kept tightly locked away from Robert the bulldozer. And I wonder if that also is a metaphor for losing him.
I hadn't thought about that. There's no question that he could be a very warm, comforting brother, but he was my big brother. And I think that I was so different from him in so many ways that I was easy to tease. I always sort of think I only have one child now, so I didn't get to see how he might have interacted with a sibling. But I tend to think siblings, there's always a sibling. I don't know if rivalry is necessarily the right word, but there's a clash between siblings as much as they love each other.
Right. I also only have one child. I always felt a little bit bad that my child didn't have the sibling to learn this, but that's where we learn how to navigate, how to have friendship or how to solve conflict. And sure, only children learn that in other ways. That is part of the role of a sibling to navigate that.
Right.
You describe so many moments as the younger sister in the book. I don't want to spoil it for people, but the one where you walked into the room and made a certain announcement with his friends there.
Oh, yeah, because I still see his friends, especially when this book came out. There was a nice book party for me in Baltimore. And yeah, David Sugarman, he still remembers that so clearly. Arnie Schuster kissed me when I was, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure I was 12 or 13 or something. But I thought the fact that I was kissed meant that I had lost my virginity. And I walked in that room and Robert wanted me out of there. He had boyfriends over his friends. He didn't want me there. And he started to call out to my mother. And I said, it's okay because I'm not a virgin, which of course everybody thought was hysterically funny. But I was really naive, but I lived in my own world back then. I didn't know. I had my comfortable little cocoon. There were certainly moments because, Robert had his friends and they were all cute and hotshot kind of guys. They weren't hotshot. They were nice guys. They were actually very nice guys. But I wanted them to like me. So I could see myself. I don't remember the exact moment, but it was a story that lived on. Let's just say both my mother and my brother repeated it because they thought it was hysterically funny.
One of those family stories that gets retold.
Yeah.
So there were some warning signs, it sounds like, in losing Robert over the time.
I think the warning signs started very early, but nobody picked up on it.
What was it like for you to write this and realize that those had been there?
When the incidents happened, at first they were kind of subtle. Like he was a lifeguard one summer and working with a lot of the chemicals that he had to work with. His story was that he took in this chemical because he thought he was exhaling, but he was inhaling or something like that. And, doing stuff like that, my brother was too smart to have made that mistake. It had to have been intentional. We grew up with animals, so he was certainly very comfortable with dogs, but there was an incident where a dog kind of attacked him. In retrospect, did Robert do something to provoke that dog? There were just a lot of incidents along the way that added together. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think if this situation was happening in this day and age, I think the parents would have been a little bit more perceptive to it because there were warning signs. I mean, the big one, and I hope I'm not giving this away because there are so many things, but Robert flunked out of Penn State. Then he went back to the University of Maryland, but then he dropped out when he was only 2 credits short of graduating. And it made no sense. My uncle, whose father had begun a big shirt factory in Baltimore, at the shirt factory, my uncle took Robert on as a manager. And Robert was good at because he was so good with people. So he was very good at what he was doing there until it came out that he was selling shirts on the side and pocketing the money. Then when he got caught, he went and took a whole bottle of aspirin and a friend had to rush him to the emergency room. That was the first big sign that there was a problem. I was in New York City when that occurred. So I was at Rolling Stone. And I remember that I think the general feeling was that it was best that I not go home. He was convalescing in a sense. both my stepsister and my mother, I think, kind of nicely said, best that you stay away. So what I did was I went out and I bought all this fabric. I went to 7th Avenue in New York and bought all this fabric and made him a patchwork quilt. Because being able to do that was like the only way I could feel like I was doing something or helping him put his life back together.
Yeah. So doing things kind of helps you sort out your emotions and your thoughts, it sounds like, even with the running.
It wasn't very long after that incident. It was probably within 2 years that he met the woman that he married. And so he married fairly quickly. So there was this horrible situation where he was basically, there was a word for it, but when you're sort of taking from your boss, and then he tries to commit suicide with aspirin, which was really definitely all a cry for help. And then all of a sudden, there's Charlene. And Charlene was blonde and tall and very pretty. So it made sense. Women always liked my brother. Walking down the wedding aisle with this beautiful young woman, was his way of saying, see, I'm okay. It was very clever. So it made us stop worrying because we were very worried.
How long were they married when he died?
He took his life on his 12th wedding anniversary. He took it on the anniversary, which I struggled with how to handle that in the book. His children, who were 7 and 9 when he took his life, are now in their late 30s, early 40s. But when I was working on the book, I was very conscious of them. I didn't want to write something that would really upset them. So I did really try to soften a lot of that. Although, I mean, the fact that he took his life on his wedding anniversary, no matter which way you look at it, says something.
Of course. Do you want to talk more about where you were that day and what that was like for you?
It's interesting. My father, who had been disbarred and bankrupt and everything, went on to become a very, very successful shopping center magnate. He built these shopping centers. I mean, he put it all together because he could do it, and he did it. He was very successful in central Pennsylvania. And Robert had a couple different jobs. I mean, he stayed with my uncle for a while, but he had other jobs. But then my father decided to put down the money to basically set up a factory, a shirt factory. Now, this was not a very good time to be setting up a shirt factory. This would have been in the mid-1980s when we were more and more outsourcing. We weren't doing that much factory work. And so timing was bad, but it does seem that he let the business fall apart, but he was hiding it. Nobody really knew how bad it was. But then he started having these, like he would, his whole, why am I drawing a blank on that? It's probably because it's so painful to even remember it, because he was bleeding. Now we know it was probably he himself was ingesting rat poison, and the effects of that were putting him in the hospital on 2 or 3 occasions. And at that point, I was very worried. And I would always go to the hospital to see him. We were all scratching our heads. One of his best friends is a doctor. I was in Washington at the time. I had moved to Washington. And I was in my office. I remember at the computer, and I must have been talking to Sandy on the phone. And suddenly there was this realization that could Robert be doing this to himself? I don't remember how much Sandy and I actually articulated that we both thought that was a possibility, but I think we all kind of knew it was. But when I kind of realized that it probably was, I was pretty devastated. There wasn't really anything I could do. I was the little sister. And I think it would have been within a year that he took his life. I was in that office and I was seeing somebody at that point, and we would have been together on the night that Robert disappeared. I always wondered if Robert maybe tried to reach me. I mean, probably did, but I like to think maybe he tried. And then of course, I felt bad because I was with Dick, and I had spent the night with Dick, and I guess left early because I had a dog, and I had to take the dog home and then get to my office. And my cousin showed up, and she said, She didn't want to say anything in front of this newsroom. So she was just saying that she needed to take me to Baltimore. I knew right away. I mean, she didn't have to tell me. I knew he'd taken his life.
Yeah. That sounds really difficult.
It was interesting because I feel like in some ways, like they knew, because he left early one morning and supposedly for the shirt factory, but he never showed up. And nobody told me. I don't know why I was always protected in those sort of situations. Yeah, they didn't want me to go home to Baltimore when I was in New York after his taking the aspirin. And then they didn't want to let me know that he was missing.
I wonder if that was in some way also his big brother way of protecting you.
Right. But it was my mother, oddly, doing it too. I don't know. I was very careful with both parents after all of that because it was so painful. I never would have published this book if either of my parents were alive because I think they made a lot of serious mistakes, but I don't think they need to see it in print.
Right.
I think it had to wait. And I'm not even sure I could fully come to grips with everything that had happened until they were gone.
Right. Because it sounds like you were able to eventually forge good relationships with both of your parents.
Yeah. I mean, I did. I probably wasn't the best daughter. I mean, I moved to Maine when my mother was still alive, and for which I think she never forgave me. But I think she just had to understand that at that point, I just had to get away. I was living in Washington and she was in Baltimore and coming to Maine. I mean, there were so many reasons I moved to Maine. I mean, it was probably one of the best decisions I made next to having my child, but it's been great. It's been perfect for me to be living here now.
It looks snowy out there.
It is. It is.
Do you still have relationships with his children?
I have excellent relationships with both of his children. I'm afraid that there was a falling out with their mother very recently. It was just kind of miscommunications. My son got married and initially it was going to be really small. And then when they realized they wanted it to be bigger and we tried to invite her, but she felt like she wasn't in the original list. And she says, I'm no longer family, which is painful, but I feel like I did what I could. And I am very close to my niece and nephew. I love saying this. I love saying it every time I say it because it makes me so happy. Both of them have advanced degrees. They're both doing great. They're both very happy. They're both married to wonderful people, and they both have two just terrific children. So I have 3 great nieces and 1 great nephew, and they're very important to me.
What a way to stay connected to family and him in some ways, right? I think family dynamics with loss are so, I don't know if challenging is the right word, complicated for sure. When there's stigma around the death or divorce or any of those challenges. Yeah. So I'm glad that you have those relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did you share your brother with your son as you were raising him?
Good question. Reed is named after my brother. We're Jewish, so he does have the same Hebrew name as my brother, but the Reed from Robert. Raising Reed in the Washington area with my niece and nephew in Baltimore, I spent as much time with them. I would take the 3 of them on trips to the Eastern Shore. I would do all kinds of things. So he was very close. I would talk to him about having lost my brother. I think it's hard on him. And I think my sense sometimes when I'm talking to him is it's painful, even though these were events that happened long before he was born. I have to say that when I had him, the only thing that kept going through my mind over and over again was I wanted him to have the best childhood. I wanted him to be happy, and I wanted him to be able to thrive. There was even a period of time raising him after my father died, could take a break from work because, as I said, my father had shopping centers. I got my master's in that period of time too and was teaching, but I was out of the newsroom. And I would just take Reed on adventures. I would pick him up at school and say, we're going on an adventure. And we'd go to a kennel and pick out a puppy. I was a scuba diver, and Reed became a scuba diver when he was like 9 years old. So we went to all these island trips diving. It was a community of divers. They all really liked Ree. Ree reminds me some of my brother. He's got a lot of my brother's charisma and charm. It was very warming to me at his wedding to listen to all the people that stood up and talked about Ree and his personality traits and who he was. I kept thinking they could be talking about Robert, talking about all the wonderful things he'd done for people, how funny he was. They could be talking about my brother.
That's beautiful.
I'm sure he's got his bad moments. I think he's happy. I mean, he's very successful. He works for Snapchat and has since almost the very beginning. So he's got a big position with them. He lives in Manhattan. His wife also works for Snapchat. They seem very happy together.
Good. Are there things specifically about sibling loss or grief that you would want other people to know that maybe you didn't know before?
It is such a specific loss. I have a dear friend here in Maine, and I remember one night I was watching TV with the person I was seeing at the time, and the phone rang, and I thought it was odd. It was Laura. She was in Boston, and she said, "I have to tell you, my sister was just killed in a car accident." And I think she felt like she had to tell me because I would understand that. I think it's a very specific kind of loss. We expect to lose our parents. We're prepared for losing our parents. And certainly we're prepared as we get older, siblings will die. But to have it be so shocking, the car accident and the suicide, I mean, not that they're really comparable, except that you don't necessarily see it coming. The shock afterwards. I was acting out. I couldn't cope. I was having a very hard time.
Mm-hmm.
Within a year of losing Robert, and I found out I was pregnant. And it was sort of the first time, I think, since losing Robert, that I felt an equilibrium. Like, yes, I am bringing this life into the world. So I think that sibling loss is very hard. I'm sure losing a husband or wife would be horrific. Losing a child is the worst of all. But losing a sibling has its own, I think it might demand more thinking through or, writing a book about it because there's so many layers of what you're dealing with. Because there's clearly the loss of somebody that was very critical to you your whole life up till that moment. And it's losing that. And yeah, it's hard.
Mm-hmm. So I'm very fond of saying that there's no loss that is harder than another. They're different. We don't necessarily understand them unless we experience them or have someone close that has. And I think what has made sibling loss really, I don't know, this is also a personal perspective, but a professional one as well, because I can see that there aren't a lot of resources for sibling loss. There are probably more now than even 5 years ago when I lost my brother, and certainly way more than when you lost your brother in the 90s.
Right.
And that goes to, I think, the sibling relationship. We don't often understand the importance of that relationship as a whole society. I was super thrilled when you reached out and sent me a copy of the book. Like, oh, this is something you've been carrying for a long time and giving permission to talk about it. And I've said this before on the podcast, and people might be sick of me saying this. My own dad lost his brother. It's probably over 60 years at this point. And it was this mythical thing, family story we all knew about. And it wasn't until Tony died that I maybe that's selfish of me, but I didn't actually give a lot of thought to that until my own brother died.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me that it seems like death or used to be, and the grief and the loss was something that was very personal to the person, to the survivors, and not something to belabor or talk about. It's something you shouldn't share. You should just suffer silently. And I like to see that things are changing, that you're doing what you're doing with this podcast and saying it is a very particular kind of loss.
Actually, as I was reading through your book and all of your stories and history with the music world, I kept thinking of Karen Carpenter and her brother. And wow, like I know that you don't mention them in the book, but I kept thinking about them and how that must have been such a public loss with the music world. That wasn't probably supported in the way that it could have been, even
Right.
publicly then.
Right.
For those of us that aren't famous, right? Like we're here struggling, trying to find support and understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I definitely acted out a lot. I was living with somebody, the father of my child, and he moved out. And, I didn't blame him. I didn't want to be with me. Why should he? Now,
Mhm.
I should say, Dick and I are to this day very good friends. And I think co parenting when you're not living together is always a challenge. But I think we did a good job. I think we made it work. And I think the big reason that it works is that we stayed very friendly. My son was also one of those sort of hotshot baseball players when he was a kid in high school. In fact, he was recruited by Bates College to play baseball. A lot of colleges, I think, were interested in him. So we had that. And Dick is athletic. I'm athletic, but I'm not talented the way they are. But, I think Reed was in a travel team. So we would both go. And the team manager would always forget and just get us one room. I would say, no, we're not married. We're not staying in the same room. Reed can stay wherever he wants, but Dick and I are going to be in different rooms. There was the morning too, because, Dick would just come over. I mean, it wasn't a big deal. I woke up one morning and he was picking Reed up early. And I kind of knew it, but didn't know it, and went to open the door and get the newspaper. And there was Dick holding the newspaper. And I looked and I said, wait, did we get married or something? Did I throw a blank here?
That's funny. Is there anything else we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? Or would you like to say more about the book in general?
I think the process of writing the book, which I think I did say what I would have wanted to say, which was that this was not a book about my brother initially, but he crept into it. And apparently a fair amount of people that read the earlier versions said that they also told me, you need to develop your brother more. But it was when this top-notch agent said, you need to develop your brother. But I went, yeah, I got to do that. And it was painful. I mean, I'm glad. I'm very glad I did it because I think I came to a lot of understanding. Because I was affected too. I mean, we both had difficult childhoods because of my father's actions and my mother's reaction to his actions. And it was not a good way to grow up. And I had to come to grips when I lost Robert, understanding that we both went through this trauma together. It's the ACEs, the acute childhood experiences. And I've been reading a lot about it. And I talk about it in my book too, until I accepted that Robert and I really went through stuff together. And he was reacting to it. I had spent my life reacting to it, but in different ways.
Absolutely.
Once I got myself out of my Baltimore phase of kind of living in an imaginary world, once I accepted that the world was fun, and I was going to have fun. And, getting a job at Rolling Stone out of college was fun. And it was a blast. I mean, there's no way around it. And everything I did there, I did with the whole anti-nuclear movement and all those musicians. It definitely had its down moments and it had its disappointments, but it was fun. I mean, it's exactly how you want to live your 20s. But what I'm trying to say is it wasn't necessarily healthy. And, I think I kind of was living on the edge in terms of I never got married. There's no doubt in my mind. I've certainly been involved with men and enjoyed relationships, but there's a point at which I can't be that intimate with someone. I think that was an offshoot of what I grew up around. So I've suffered too,
of course,
but I'm not sure I was able, until I did the book, I hadn't really understood the extent to which my childhood explains a lot of the things I didn't do or felt incapable of doing. And I'm sorry about that. I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't get married. I could have married my college boyfriend. Dick and I could have gotten married if I hadn't gotten pregnant. But I mean, the point is that it's affected me. And I'm also at that beautiful point in my life where, I'm looking out now at 7.5 acres. If it weren't snowing, I can kind of see the water. So I'm waterfront property. And I've got 2 dogs, so I'm always out there. I'm always running around with them in the woods and at the water and stuff. And I'm in a situation here in Waldoboro, Maine, where it's just a phenomenal community of friends. I'm on board. So I'm like thinking, this is, I hate to say final stage, but it is. I mean, this is the wind down stage of my life. Sure, I wish that I had a partner. I mean, I've had them in Maine, but like I said, I'm not very good at those kinds of relationships. So
Yeah.
that kind of intimacy, I should say.
Mhm. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So, before I get to the final one, so your parents have both passed and your brother has passed. I know a lot of our listeners and myself, because my parents are aging, have thought about this time. Like, you are the last person standing in that family, that immediate family. What has that been like for you? Or even as you're talking about, you're living this life that you're enjoying now,
Mm-hmm.
not having your brother, not having your parents. What has that been like?
I love my niece and nephew so much. And I wish that they were still that happy family when my brother was alive. That I don't have that. I still feel like there's this hope. And also, Robert was my only sibling.
Mhm.
So that leaves me with being the receptacle of memories. Although it's funny because my nephew has been very curious lately, not so much about Robert's and my childhood, but our family coming over to this country from Eastern Europe. And he's going to take a trip to where my father grew up in the Eastern Shore of Virginia, which I think is really interesting. I actually had taken him back there when he was a child, but I'm not sure he remembers it that well. I mean, it's hard. But I'm glad that I have my niece and nephew, and certainly very glad I have a son. I think if I didn't have a child right now, I might feel like there was a big omission in my life. It's like I can say, well, I never married. That's an omission, but that's not the kind of omission that I can't live with. Whereas I think if I had never had a child, that would have been a significant omission. And, just sort of to tie it all back, I got pregnant really within months of losing my brother. And I'm not a spiritual person per se. There's always this part of me that feels like it was kind of a beyond the grave kind of, here I am using birth control, but getting pregnant. Why did it happen when it happened?
So balancing that life and death at the same time. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, and thank you so much for writing your book and being so vulnerable with your readers. I connected with many, many parts of your story.
I'm glad.
Like direct, but yeah, very much connected.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because to be honest with you, I always thought the real selling point of the book was the rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, it hasn't been. I haven't done a lot of media, but all the feedback I get from people about the book, they don't talk about the rock and roll. They talk about it being very much a sibling book.
There's another author that I interviewed a while ago, Nico Slate. He wrote the book Brothers. He's a historian, and he set out to write his book on very specific parts of history that he's familiar with. And he got the same feedback from his editor and his agents. Like, your brother's part of this. You need to write this about your brother. And so he did, and it's actually called Brothers. So I think it speaks to how much these relationships and these losses help our narrative form. Literally, the narrative of your book changed because you got that feedback. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My last question to you is, what are some of your favorite memories of you and Robert?
My father remarried fairly quickly. Once he sort of got his stuff together, I mean, he was not going to be a lawyer. He met a woman who ironically had gone to high school with my mother, Shirley, and they got married fairly quickly. But again, my father had no money and he was a caretaker. They moved to the Vagabond Motel in Aberdeen, Maryland. When Shirley and my father first got married, that was where they lived, taking care of it. Was definitely a, rent by the hour kind of place. For some reason, I loved that motel. I loved going there. And I just remember The woman that my father married had 2 children 10 years older than Robert and I. So the last place they wanted to be living at was this flea bag motel. So they were not there on the weekends at all. So Robert and I would be taken there. I don't know whose bedroom we would sleep in, but we were sleeping in the same bedroom. And if I ever got kind of concerned, because it was an old house and I'm sure there were mice on the walls and stuff like that, Robert would just put the covers over us and bring in a flashlight and just tell me stories. That's a really good memory. I mean, those memories. But, there's a lot of good memories. When he and his wife would come to stay with me in New York, I like to walk, and cold doesn't bother me. Obviously, I'm living in Maine. I mean, none of this bothers me. And, things would happen like they'd come and stay with me. And I lived in Chelsea and they would want to go to have Chinese food in Chinatown. I said, well, we can walk. Now, they didn't know how far it was. I did. And, it was kind of like, my brother was very, very funny. He had a witty sense of humor. And I just remember cracking up and cracking everybody up. I know he absolutely adored me, but he also loved that I was so different, that I was quirky, and I am. And that's who I am. And certainly my New York years were particularly quirky. I love that he laughed at me. I love that he could make humor out of it. But he was also, until the very end, the person I turned to.
Well, thank you for that. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for being on the show. Thank you so much for listening. Our theme song was written by Joe Millwood and Brian Dean and was performed by Joe Millwood. If you would like more information on The Broken Pack, go to our website, thebrokenpack.com. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter, Wild Grief, to learn about opportunities and receive exclusive information and grieving tips for subscribers. Information on that, our social media, and on our guests can be found in the show notes wherever you get your podcasts. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share. Thanks again.
You're second guessing, oh, you never know, you just never know.